Hey everybody, this is Josh from writesjosh.com, and in this video I'm taking on the issue of newsstand editions versus direct editions. Full disclosure, I collect newsstand editions. I really like them. I think it's a great intersection of comic book history and also comic investment speculation. I think it has a lot to offer on a lot of different levels. But one of the things I've noticed, there's been a bunch of videos lately and just forum postings, for a couple of years now. They've been going back and forth on whether or not newsstand editions add any value, and I've seen lately though there's been a lot of misinformation out there. It's not on purpose. I think that people are just getting a little bit confused when people start to realize, well, what is this newsstand? Why is it getting charged or demanding such a higher price on eBay or whatever? So they start to look into it, and I've noticed there has been some confusion on this. So I thought I'd put this together. It's ambitious. I'm going to try and explain everything in abbreviated fashion, right? So hopefully this video won't be too long. All right, so newsstand editions. First, I'm going to talk about what are they, and then are they rare? Do grading companies recognize these things? And really, for a collector out there, does any of this matter? All right, so first, newsstand editions. I'm going to try and do this fairly briefly, but I think it's important to kind of get an idea where newsstand editions come from. Because they're not variants that people are used to seeing now, where the covers look different, and that has nothing to do with what the newsstand editions are. It's a business model, basically, and I'm sure that, this is heavily simplified for the people that really want to get into it, the different relationships that Marvel and DC had with their newsstand carriers and the different stores. So I'm not going to get into any of that. There's a lot of stuff out there if you want to look into it. But just basically, why do some comics have a UPC barcode and some don't? This is the answer, right? So comic companies sold to in the 70s, 80s, right before that, and after, they sold to stores, bookstores, pharmacies, and newsstands. And so that's where the newsstand edition comes from. That was one of the main places that comic books were sold. Were sold to newsstands. So in this business model, the comic companies sell to the store. The store gives them a bunch of money, right? And then they sell to their customers. And comic book companies make money with this. The stores make money. Everybody's good. But what happens when the store doesn't sell one of the comics that they bought from the comic company? In that case, they were able to return that comic back to the comic company. When this happened, comic companies are upset because they are losing money now. But what's key here is that it's that UPC on the comic that allowed the store to send it back. So that's what tracked the product, and that's what allowed them to get the refund. All right, so a new business model. The comic companies, 1978, 1979, is really when these things, they start looking at different models to try things out. Different distribution companies are coming up to work with them to make that happen. Comic companies sell to now, this was really tried out with local comic shops in the late 70s, early 80s. And so they would sell the comics to the comic shops just as before, but they would sell it for less than what they sold it to the newsstands. And you can see here, right, comic companies, the comic stores keep some of that money, and they sell to the customer. The flip side of this, though, is that they could not return unsold comics back to the comic companies. So now, under this model, when the comic company sells the comic, they don't have to worry about whether they're going to be able to keep that money, whether they're going to have to spend some of it buying back their own product, right? And what's important here is that the initially, direct editions still had the UPC, but it had that strike through it, right? So that strike through is what prevented the comic book stores from returning the comic back to the comic factories, right? So I think, just as a side note, what I find interesting about this is that I really think this had a lot to do with the whole development of the dollar bins and everything that comes along with comic book culture, going and finding those gems, right? Because what did these comic book stores do when they had all this inventory that they couldn't sell back? They put it in boxes and let people go through it and buy it at reduced prices. All right, so the strike through didn't last very long because people didn't like the way it looked, and so they changed it. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of different kind of cool. So I think it's kind of cool pictures, graphics that they put in the box. And over time, though, that sort of shifted back to the barcode, pretty much because there really aren't any newsstand editions out there anymore. I mean, every once in a while, I mean, even a couple of years ago, there are some, but I'll talk about it in a little bit here about how they're really rare. And the barcodes have some use too now because, as you can see from like Amazing Spider-Man 700 and 800, there's just a ton of variants. And so it helps the collector see, you know, whether or not, at least DC, you can see what, if it's a first printing or a second printing, you can see what the variant is. So that can be helpful. All right, so that is essentially what, that's the history in a nutshell of newsstand editions and direct editions, where they came from. So now the question is, are they rare? All right, so this is Mile High Comics website. And Mile High Comics, for those that don't know, they've been around quite a while. They sell a ton of comics, and they put a huge premium on newsstands. So they wrote this article here. They put this up to explain why it is that they charge 2 times the regular amount for a newsstand as opposed to a direct edition, you know, from 1979 to 1985. You can see that here. After 2005, they'll charge up to 10 times, right, for a newsstand edition. So this is their explanation as to why they're doing that. It's a little bit of the history. But what I'm keying in on here is just the data that they're using to support. I took this data. I think it tells an interesting story, and I put it on a graph here. So you can see that as time goes on, comic book companies preferred the direct market path, and I think so did the comic book stores, right? Because they have a pretty good idea of how many comics they need to buy in order to sell, right? So they just like saving money that way because they could get the comics from the comic book companies at a cheaper price. So over time, you can see the direct market editions are increasing as a percentage of the market, and newsstand editions are going down. And this has a pretty interesting effect in terms of the rarity of the newsstand editions. Now, I want to point out something here, that when you're looking at newsstand editions and deciding whether or not they're rare, condition has a lot to do with it. Because it's not just that they had smaller print runs eventually, which they did. It's that when they sold newsstands to pharmacies or bookstores, the people that put them on the racks didn't really take care of them. A lot of times the customers that bought them weren't collectors, so they didn't take really good care of them. And so there's just not a whole lot of newsstand editions out there for certain years that are in high grade. For high grade, I'm considering 9.4 and higher, right? So anything 9.4 and higher in newsstand, especially later on in time, gets to be really, really difficult to find. You contrast that with the direct edition. Those comics were sold to comic book stores who took care of the comics, who sold those comics to collectors who took care of the comics. So direct edition, it's not as uncommon to see those comics in high grades, right? But if you can find a newsstand, it's where it starts to get rare. I'm going to kind of show this. My goal here is to prove that to you, actually, with just a quick survey of eBay, 1984. So, but we've looked at this on eBay, see what we have in CGC 9.8, and you can see there's pretty good representation of the newsstands, direct, newsstand. So it's a pretty even split, which isn't terribly surprising since we know that there were a lot more newsstands, but directs that people take care of them better. But 1986 is about 50-50. So we should expect to see if there's really 50-50 an even split. But this is why newsstands are so rare, right, in the high grade. Check this out. X Factor 6, it's the first appearance of Apocalypse. Direct. This is a direct. All right, I'll show you. So you can see direct. There's one newsstand, direct. So yeah, and I won't call it each out, but you get the idea here that even though there's a 50-50 split in terms of the print run, the direct edition is way more prevalent at the 9.8 grade. And as you go further in time, right, so this is 1980 or 1990, Uncanny X-Men 266, it's the first appearance of Gambit. Again, you just see this over and over again, all the directs. There's one newsstand here, but for the most part, you just see direct after direct after direct. If you look at New Mutants 98, got a newsstand. And then, I'm not going to get into pricing too much in this video, but what you will see, if you spend some time looking into this, that the newsstand editions are getting people are asking a lot more for them, and oftentimes people are paying those prices. But here I just want to talk about the rarity, and you can see that while there are some newsstands out there, overwhelmingly they're all directs. Now, Mile High's data that I put together for that chart, they were just looking at Marvel, but it is not strictly a Marvel phenomenon. If you look here, this is, I think, 1992 Superman, Man of Steel, first appearance of Doomsday. This is DC, obviously, and here you can see again 9.8 grade. It is just over and over again direct editions. There's one newsstand. But for the most part, this is all direct, right? So you get some idea of why people consider newsstands to be rare. I think they are, especially when you get past 1980, I would say 1984. 1984 in a high grade, they become really difficult to find. It's not just because of the print run, as we've seen, it's because of the of how well they were maintained, who bought them, who was the customer. And I think X Factor 6 does a great job of highlighting that. So which ones are rare? This is super subjective, right? Because just at the outset, because I know I'm going to get beat up for this, but rare is relative. So as an extreme example, compared to Action Comics #1, no newsstand is rare, right? Just because it's a newsstand. It might be rare for other reasons, but it's not going to be rare, relative to Action Comics #1. On the other side, not rare doesn't mean it's scarce. Hulk 181 is not a particularly rare comic. Our newsstand is pretty much they were all newsstands, right? But the point is it's still scarce because demand for the comic exceeds the supply. So even though it's a newsstand, that doesn't make it necessarily rare. And if it's rare, it's still subjective. That said, this is what I think about newsstand editions and direct editions. Newsstands in high grade, that's 9.4 or higher after 1984, I would definitely consider those rare. They're really hard to get, and when you find them, they command a much higher price on the market. And there's some second printings out there that are newsstand editions that are exceptionally difficult to find. So like the second appearance, or the second printing of the first appearance of Tim Drake as Robin is really rare. Superman 50, second printing, the newsstand is also, some of these comics are just really hard to find. Any grade, though, that is any newsstand before 1982, it doesn't really matter what the grade is. Those are not really rare because overwhelmingly those were all newsstand editions. Direct editions, on the flip side, before 1982, they're somewhat rare because there are just not that many of them getting produced. Now, the ones that were worth sold, they generally were taken pretty good care of. There's just not that many of them relative to the rest of the market. And then any direct edition after 1983, I would consider not rare. That's assuming that there isn't something else going on, like it's an exceptionally rare variant. I'm just saying it's not rare because it's a direct edition. All right, so covered what newsstand editions are, covered if they're rare. Now, here's one where there is a lot of misconception out there. This question of whether or not grading companies recognize direct editions versus newsstand editions. All right, so the first one, CGC. So CGC rarely recognizes newsstand editions. So I think that makes people think that they never do, which is just wrong, right? CGC does recognize newsstand editions. They do recognize newsstand price editions, and they also recognize newsstand variants. I'll just briefly say what that is, but there's other blogs out there I'll post to in the comment section that really go into great detail about all those things. But a Newsstand Edition, they will put that on their label as long as the Newsstand Edition really varied in some way from the direct edition. So as an example of that is Spawn 9. Spawn 9, the direct edition, had a poster inside it. It was made from high gloss paper. The Newsstand Edition, they're trying to save money, so there's no poster. The paper is clearly of inferior quality. It's just like newspaper quality. And so that's separate from the fact that there's a barcode that you can tell. There's the date that's different on the front of the cover. But they recognize Spawn 9 as a newsstand because of those manufacturing differences. The price editions, the Newsstand price editions, they'll put that on the label sometimes if there's, I think if it's $1 or more on the price variant. So you'll see things like, that's not always the case because they'll make a note for like Star Wars and different things. But the point is they do make some variations. They'll say Newsstand price and they'll have what the price is. The Newsstand variants, meaning that the barcode actually aligned with another comic there, so it's like an error. They'll notate that on and other kinds of errors, they'll notate that on the label too. All right, CBCS. Well, as of April 2017, last year, CBCS recognizes the difference between Newsstand and direct editions. And so I've just pulled one up here to make that clear. That's what they're doing, and that's the Facebook announcement that they put out when they did it. But a lot of people think no grading companies are recognizing Newsstand Editions, and that's just not true, right? And what's cool about CBCS recognizing it is that they're doing it simply because they see the need in the market. A lot of collectors really like newsstands, and so they're responding to that. And then PGX has been doing this for a while. I don't know when they started, but you can look at their different labels and see that they've been covering recognizing the difference between direct and newsstands for quite some time. All right, so I give that 2 big thumbs up because that, again, I think is a lot of people look to the grading companies to decide what is a legitimate quality or character aspect of comics to invest in. And the idea that no grading company out there is actually noting the difference between these two sort of steers some people away from that. And unfortunately, that's not accurate. All 3 of them, the major grading companies, recognize Newsstand Editions in some capacity. All right, so does any of this even matter? If you spend more than 5 minutes on Google looking at the different forums and blogs, you will see that if it doesn't matter, people are spending a lot of time talking about Newsstand Editions. I think it's crazy that so many people out there want to sort of pour water on the fire of this growing niche within the comic collecting community. That said, they're losing, right? At least in my opinion, because when I'm buying a Newsstand Edition, I always have to pay more to beat the market to get it than the direct edition counterpart. And when I sell a newsstand, I get more for it. So there's clearly a demand out there, but people go back and forth on this one. When you're thinking about whether or not you want to invest in newsstands or get into it, I would probably just ask yourself why you're collecting comics in the first place. If you're doing it to invest or to speculate, then absolutely, I'd start keeping an eye out for Newsstand Editions. And if you're going to buy a comic and you have a choice, go with the newsstand over the direct edition. If you collect comics just because they're rare, right, and you're going for those either historical oddities or just you just like things that are difficult to come by, you like the hunt of finding those gems, newsstands are for you then, because there's some really difficult ones to find. Now, if you're a collector just because you don't even care about the investment aspect of it, you just like the stories, or whether or not you just buy comics strictly for the art, either extreme, whether it's just for the story or just for the art, I don't think it probably makes that much of a difference. But ultimately you've got to decide for yourself. But in any case, I hope that when you are making that decision, that this video helped you. If you've liked it, please hit like. If you want to see more of these, please hit the subscribe button. I'd be really interested in people's comments. Like I put up here. There's a lot of back and forth on this, and so if some of that takes place in the comment section, that'd be really interesting to see. All right, thanks for watching. This is Josh from writesjosh.com.